All right, let's jump right in. We are tackling what might be one of the most famously difficult chapters in the entire Bible, 1 Corinthians 11. I mean, for centuries, this text has been a real puzzle, you know? It's sparked just intense debate and has really shaped how people think about gender, worship, and authority. So that begs the question, right? Why? Why is this one chapter so fiercely debated? Well, the answer is kind of like a perfect storm of tricky language, cultural context that's, well, totally lost to us, and, let's be honest, some really high stakes in our modern world. And I am not exaggerating how tough this is. I mean, biblical scholar Dr. Gary Meadors basically calls this chapter notorious for a reason. It's just packed with these super important words that are really hard to nail down. And on top of that, we can't help but read it through the lens of our own debates about gender today, which, just makes things even trickier. So, to even begin to untangle this thing, we've got to start where the author, Paul, starts. See, he doesn't just pull new rules out of thin air. He grounds his entire argument in what he calls tradition. But what did tradition actually mean in his world? The key Greek word here is paradoses. And this wasn't just, the way we've always done things. Not at all. It meant something much more specific. Authoritative, established Christian teachings that were carefully handed down. So when Paul uses this word, he's basically sending a huge signal to the Corinthians. He's saying, hey, I'm not making this up. I'm just reminding you of the foundational truths you already know. Okay, so this leads to a really important distinction we have to make whenever we read ancient texts. Is a passage prescriptive, meaning is it a command for all people for all time, or is it just descriptive, simply telling us how things were done back then in that specific time and place? The argument is that Paul sees his teaching here as prescriptive. It's a core part of that authoritative tradition, that paradosis we just talked about. All right, so we've established Paul is appealing to tradition. But here's the kicker. That entire tradition, his whole argument, hinges on one single, incredibly debated word. Seriously, this word is the absolute epicenter of the entire controversy. And what's really wild is how often he uses it. Get this. Paul uses the word head 10 times in just 8 verses. 10 times. That is absolutely not an accident. When an author does that, it's like they're grabbing you by the shoulders and pointing, saying, look here, this is what matters. He's forcing his readers to really wrestle with what this one little word actually means. So what's the word? It's the Greek word kephale. Now on the surface, it's simple. It means head, the thing on top of your shoulders. But Paul is obviously using it as a metaphor. And, well, that's where the real puzzle kicks in. What on earth is this metaphor supposed to mean? And this is where scholars are just completely and intensely divided. Does kephale mean head like a boss, someone with authority, or a ruler, which would imply a hierarchy? Or does it mean head in the sense of a source or origin? Like the head of a river is its source. Depending on how you answer that one question, it radically changes how you read everything else in this chapter. It's a huge fork in the road. And believe me, the stakes here could not be higher. This isn't just about gender roles, not by a long shot. Because Paul also uses this same head metaphor to talk about the relationship between God the Father and Christ. So yeah, how you define this one word has massive implications for some of the most core Christian beliefs, like the nature of the Trinity itself. So, as you can imagine, these two very different ways of understanding kephale have led to 2 major competing schools of thought when it comes to figuring this all out today. So on one side, you have those who believe kephale means authority. They tend to hold to a hierarchical view where men are given leadership roles in the church and home. Then on the other side, you have those who see kephale as source. They hold an egalitarian view, arguing for total equality in roles with no restrictions based on gender. It's amazing, right? This one little Greek word, kephale, is the single point where these 2 completely different frameworks split off. And just when you think you've got it figured out, to make things even more complicated, there's a third term that gets thrown around a lot, complementarianism. Now, this view argues that men and women are equal in value, but have different complementary roles. Sounds simple enough, but what that actually means in practice is, you guessed it, also super heavily debated. Some versions sound a lot like the hierarchical view, and others sound more egalitarian. It's a whole other can of worms. Okay, let's zoom in on a specific detail here for a second. Paul says men should pray with their heads uncovered. But why?
Well, this is where some context from archaeology is super helpful. A guy named Richard Oster points out that in Corinth, which was a Roman colony, elite Roman men would actually cover their heads with their toga when they worshipped pagan gods. So for a Christian man to do the same thing could have been a really bad look, right? It could have signaled that he was mixing his Christian worship with pagan practices.
Okay, so that's the men. What about the women? Why should their heads be covered? Well, the traditional, more hierarchical argument, which scholar Joseph Fitzmyer summarizes really well, builds its case from a bunch of different angles. It points to the creation order back in Genesis. It talks about a kind of theological pecking order: God, then Christ, then man, then woman. It also brings in the social customs of the day and even general church discipline. And then it all ends with this famously strange and cryptic line: because of the angels. Yeah, nobody's totally sure what that means. So, after looking at all this, why does this ancient puzzle stick around? Why can't we just find one simple answer and call it a day? Well, it's pretty simple, really. The core problems that made it so tough to understand in the first place, they haven't gone anywhere. When you get right down to it, the debate is here to stay because of that perfect storm we mentioned earlier. You've got ambiguous Greek words like kephale. We're still not 100% sure about all the specific cultural stuff going on in Corinth, and we're basically listening to a one-way telephone conversation, you know? Paul assumes his audience knows all this background stuff that's just lost to us. And, let's be real, our own modern agendas about gender definitely color how we interpret the whole thing. And this brings us to a final and I think really powerful idea. Dr. Meadors suggests that maybe, just maybe, we've been focusing on the wrong question this whole time. What if the passage isn't primarily about how men and women relate to each other, but about how all people, men and women, are supposed to relate to God when they come together for worship? And that kind of leaves us with one final thought to chew on. When you're facing a text this complicated, is the real goal to find that one single final answer? Or is the goal to better understand the deep, important, and enduring questions about God and creation and worship that a text like this forces every single one of us to ask? It's something to think about.